Hello, and welcome to my book talk about a book I enjoyed so much I forced my mom to read it just so that I could have someone to talk to. My name is Megan, and lately I've been reading a lot of World War II fiction. Maybe I'm a bit jaded, but I'm beginning to feel like a lot of them are kind of telling the same story. Now, I know that World War II has so many different elements to it, but a lot of them feel like they're about the Nazis and the persecution of the Jews and the concentration camps or the resistance and down with Hitler. But there's so much more out there. And so I've always been looking for something a little bit different. And that's why I really enjoy the book, The Soldier's Wife by Margaret Leroy. And even though this one has a lot of those elements with the resistance and the Nazis, that's not what this story is really about, or those are just like back elements. This is a character-driven story about a woman, Vivienne, who is on the island of Guernsey, taking care of her two daughters and her mother-in-law who has dementia while her husband is off at war. And this takes place right around the time that the Germans come and occupy the island. So a lot of this book is about how she goes about her day-to-day life and deals with the fact that the Germans are on the island and what that does for their life. And to complicate matters, a group of German officers move into the house right next door to her. And so that puts her on edge, and how does that affect life? And then to make things more interesting, she actually begins a love affair with one of the officers next door. And what's so intriguing about this is that it then draws the question of whether or not wearing the uniform inherently makes you a bad person, or if there are other elements going on to it. But then she discovers that there's a work camp on the island and how the people are treated. And she really begins to question whether or not she can trust the person that she's sleeping with. And then you get to the ending, and I can't give it away, but it's just something that has stayed with me for months after reading the book. So there's so much that I could talk to about this book. But what's interesting is that in some ways, I kind of felt like not a lot happened in the book. So much of it is about her day-to-day life and visiting neighbors and how the people on the island cope with the German occupation. And that was kind of refreshing because it wasn't all about taking down the Nazis and joining the war resistance. It was about life and how life has to go on despite the fact that the war is going on. So that was refreshing. But yet at the same time, it kind of does a disservice to the book to say that nothing happens, because there are so many little pivotal moments throughout the book that really are thought-provoking and get you questioning the human condition and what people do to survive the war, and whether or not you're bad just because you're a part of the Nazi movement or German. And so this book is really thought-provoking and so emotional because you really get to know the characters and their struggles and all the different perspectives of what it is to survive during the war. And one little thing that I really liked about this book is it's a quick read. Part of that is because there are really short chapters, and so you easily fall into that trap of, oh, just one more chapter, and that wasn't enough, so you keep reading. And it's easily read in a day or two, but it's simplistic, but yet so thought-provoking and emotional. Now, with this being historical fiction, there's so many questions that you end up having then about what was real and what was fiction. And so what was life really like back then? And so to answer those questions, it's easy to turn to nonfiction. And I found like 3 books that really capture some of the elements of the book. I couldn't get physical copies, so I did find covers. The first one kind of touches on an element from the beginning of the book, which was her decision of whether or not to evacuate her 2 daughters off to England. And that is a difficult decision, and she couldn't make it. So I was curious about what that was really like, and I found it's called Guernsey Evacuees, The Forgotten Evacuees of the Second World War by Gillian Mallon. And so that would be a great book to learn more about what people went through with the evacuation and saying goodbye to their children for who knows how long. But then the book, The Soldier's Wife, is more about like the German occupation. And so learning more about that, there's this one, The German Occupation of the Channel Islands by Chalk Cruikshank. This is definitely going to give more of a specific experience about what it was like in that area of the occupation, because being an island, it was probably different than what it was like in the mainland of like occupied France or whatever. But this book, as I've said, is so much about the personal experience that the civilians lived. So I was really surprised to discover that there is someone's actual personal account. The quality of the picture is poor. I apologize for that. But it's called Guernsey Under Occupation. It's the Second World War Diaries of Violet Carey. And so she's upper middle class woman, and it's her personal diaries. You don't get more authentic than that. So that would be a really great example to hear about what someone actually went through. Now, if you're like me, you prefer historical fiction. And there are a ton of books that actually would really work well to pair with The Soldier's Wife. The first one is a little bit of a no-brainer. It is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Schaefer and Annie Barrows. Not only does this also take place on the island of Guernsey, but it deals with a lot of the same things where it was what was life like back then, and also kind of toys with the idea of whether or not just because you wear the uniform, you're bad. And that theme also kind of continues a little bit in this book, The Commandant's Girl by Pam Jenoff. This one does deal with more of the resistance movement and life for the Jews during the war. But as a character begins working with a Nazi commandant, she begins to question, along with the reader, whether or not he's bad just because he wears the uniform. But if you wanted more information about what life was like during the German occupation, I would suggest The Baker's Secret by Stephen P. Kiernan. This one, it takes place in Normandy. And so it all culminates up to the invasion of Normandy. And so it's what life was like in a small village near that area, and creates discusses how the villagers kind of created this bartering system to get through the war and help each other. So that was a really interesting read. And it just goes to show that there are so many different elements of World War II. There are so many stories out there that it was really refreshing and enjoyable to read a book that is more kind of the everyday man's account, without being so many of the typical storylines. So The Soldier's Wife is a great book. It is really thought-provoking. Like I said, the ending is something that I still talk to my mom about because it grips your soul and just leaves you so touched by what these characters have endured. And so it's a great read. I hope you pick it up and enjoy it. Thank you for listening.